our reading this morning, I'd ask you to take your Singing the Living Tradition hymnal and have a look inside. You have the title page, and then you have the contents, and then you have the preface, and then you have another title page, and then you have a page that lists our 7 principles and our sources. So if you never knew they were there, we've already explored something new for you. Up at the top it says, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote," and it goes on to our 7 principles. But then below that, something that we rarely look at, the living tradition we share draws from many sources. And you can read that we have several things, and then we get to the bottom source, which is, and let's read this together, humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. And then it says, grateful for the religious pluralism which enriches and ennobles our faith, we are inspired to deepen our understanding and expand our vision. As free congregations, we enter into this covenant, promising to one another our mutual trust and support. I believe that Unitarian Universalism is, most of all, a practical religion. The Reverend John Burens writes in Our Chosen Faith that being a UU means supporting one another in our ethical and spiritual living, attempting to bear witness to our highest values in our everyday lives, and in that way, having a positive influence on community life. Indeed, UU humanist minister John Dietrich declared that the transformation of society is the cornerstone of Unitarian religion. In fact, in this year of celebrations for the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, Ken Herto says that Unitarian Universalism is sometimes referred to as the Church of the Continuing Reformation. Earl Morse Wilbur, the great historian of 19th century Unitarianism, struggled, as we often do today, to name the central message of liberal religion. The Unitarian abolitionist minister Theodore Parker declared in the mid-19th century that true religion is not found in the tropes and creeds of any church. It is found in a moral life. And for Parker, Jesus was the moral exemplar who is worthy of our devotion in the same way that Muslims honor Muhammad. Wilbur, the historian, agreed and concluded his history of Unitarianism by identifying not a creed, but 3 core ideals or pillars of the free church. And those pillars were reason, freedom, and tolerance. Let's examine reason briefly. We are spiritual descendants of the Enlightenment. I would venture to say that as Unitarian Universalists, we feel that faith should not be at odds with rational thought or natural evidence. The appeal to rationality was originally a challenge to understand fundamentalism and the revealed religion that simply took Scripture verbatim. It was a reaction against that fundamentalist idea of revealed religion that was sealed. Freedom, as a pillar of our faith tradition, is demonstrated in freedom of the pulpit and freedom of the pew. This is an old ideal, created when the Transylvanian Unitarian King John Sigismund declared in 1568 that the first guarantee of religious freedom in the Western world was known as the Edict of Torda. And after weeks of scriptural debate between the Roman Catholics, the Calvinists, the Lutherans, and followers of Francis David, King John issued the edict, saying that in his kingdom, preachers shall preach the truth of faith as they best understand it without fear of punishment. And if the people like it, good. If not, the people shall not be compelled in any way to follow that teaching. In that era, it was a remarkable statement: freedom of the pulpit, freedom of the pew. And here's an interesting example of how that works. At the First Unitarian Church of Alton, Illinois, in December 1836, the new minister, Charles Andrew Farley, preached on which is the true church. Farley saw the true church not in any single sect, but rather in the good in all these churches. In the church universal, he included not only Jews and Christians, but all who live under the light of nature, as well as Hindus and traditional Native Americans. Well, the sermon was printed and distributed locally, but widely. But not all citizens shared Farley's broad ideas, and in 1837, an armed mob gunned down his friend, the abolitionist newspaperman Elijah Lovejoy. Farley, having been threatened himself, fled to Boston. The Alton congregation went into decline, but persevered, and in 1856, their minister of that time was accused of being an abolitionist, and he offered his resignation, but the congregation declined it, affirming freedom of the pulpit. The minister had the right to preach what he felt on his heart. Theologian Bernard Loomer says that freedom is not an end in itself. It exists in order to enrich our communal life. And to him, it is so important to use it wisely, because as human civilization advances, as we achieve greater freedoms for minority groups, better understand the dignity of the other, we create, he says, the need for adopting disciplines that are more complex and requiring virtues beyond anything the human spirit has known. When Loomer said this in 1985, he himself remained uncertain as to whether we humans would be able to respond adequately to this challenge. And he said, if the response is inadequate, the human organism may turn out to be a dead end. Unitarian Universalists have long cherished the pillar of freedom. Ken Herto says, we ought to be able to say what matters and why, and say it so it makes sense to others. We ought also to be open to challenge and to demonstrate how our beliefs guide our lives. That's the ideal of our worship life, end quote. And so that leads us to our third pillar, tolerance, something that we probably agree is in short supply all over the world at the moment. As limited as we are as human beings, when we practice tolerance, it introduces humility, something too often lacking among religious zealots. The Puritans notoriously were awfully ungenerous in their ability to welcome diverse expressions of faith and religious sensibility in the New England culture. But of course, they had the example in the Old World before then of the Roundheads in England, the Calvinists in Switzerland, and before that, the Inquisition and the Crusades. Intolerance has a long pedigree. And it is a curious task, tolerance, to believe what you know is so, to live your truth with passion, and yet remain skeptical, mindful that you may not have the whole story. Indeed, you might be wrong. I can tell my own story of feeling that the Catholic Church left me after decades of devout practice and theological training that I loved and that nurtured me. The reactionary and, in some areas of teaching, fundamentalist papacy of John Paul II made me sad and angry and basically unable to worship any longer in that faith tradition. But after the thirst for religious community that I experienced was watered by this congregation, and I began to share my story, I was told by a former Catholic nun, no less, not you, that I could still be a Catholic and be a Unitarian Universalist. There was another ex-Catholic nun in this congregation. Now, I decided after much thought that this was not true for me, but I interpreted her remark to mean I cannot separate my former identity as a Catholic from my current one as a UU. Indeed, I would not be the UU I am if I had not been the Catholic that I was. Jane Zepka writes that if the central story of a religion can't be shown literally to be true, many reasonably are unwilling to base their life on it. But some Unitarian Universalists find merit enough in the Jesus story or the Buddha story to find inspiration or indeed a spiritual foundation. For them, the objective historical truth doesn't matter one way or the other. What matters is the wisdom found in the long-standing legend. When a story offers a basis for hope, health, celebration, and good works, why not call it a keeper? You are the person who decides which stories are your religious stories, which seem like trickery and which speak to you as higher truths. Those are yours to decide as well. You, with your passions and your quirks and your particular preferences, are the person who chooses the stories for your life, the stories that buoy and sustain you, alert and amuse you, and fill your spirit. Mary Oliver, in her poem, How I Go to the Woods, writes, I have my way of praying, as you no doubt have yours. Some of us come to Unitarian Universalism because we didn't find what we were looking for in another faith tradition. Some of us never had a faith tradition, and others are escaping pretty drastically from a faith tradition that they believe has oppressed them, tricked them, or let them down through the all-too-human actions of the leaders of that faith community. Some of us have experiences that lead us to label other religions or practices as wrong. And this is where we fall down in our practice of tolerance. And here is where the rest of the statement on the humanist source comes into play. After it says, humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, is the phrase, and warn us against the idolatries of the mind and spirit. I think we are quick to identify and condemn idolatries of the spirit, but have pretty much given a pass to those idolatries of the mind. Maybe the slogan of Unitarian Universalism, that we need not think alike to love alike, is a restatement of live and let live. Because the covenant is the thing we are meant to focus on. Not what we believe, but what we do with our beliefs. I don't feel competent to judge another person's heart or tell them what they must or must not believe. The spiritual task for UUs is best described by this pretty stark Buddhist proverb to me. If you meet the Buddha on the highway, kill him. The Reverend Edward Erickson interprets it this way: this harsh maxim drives home a great truth. No holy prophet, Messiah, Christ, Avatar, or even a great God in heaven can do your spiritual or ethical work for you. Free yourself. Be a lamp to your own salvation. And that is a directive for me to work on my own spiritual journey and leave others to figure out their own. Yes, the 7 principles are basically our creed, and our living tradition draws upon 6 sources. But actually, there are more than just 6. If you look at the part of the UUA website that describes who we are, you'll see Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism among the many beliefs of people who call themselves UU. For example, it says there are many areas of common concern for Western Buddhists and Unitarian Universalists. For the most part, Western Buddhists and UUs are deeply committed to ecological concerns. In general, both are attracted to issues of economic justice, and both movements have been engaged in questions of justice for the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender communities. While both movements have essentially a white and middle-class membership, each shares a deep concern with issues of racial justice. And it gets even more complicated because pagan, Jewish, and Christian Unitarian Universalists have also been attracted to the practical mysticism of Buddhism. And a number have tried various Buddhist meditation disciplines, and some, like the Reverend Eric Walker Wickstrom, who is a UU Christian, maintain regular Zen meditation practice. I think we must attempt not only to value diversity, but pluralism, which engages diversity toward a positive end, which is commitment to the common good. So, what is it that makes some of us want to impose UU orthodoxy, if there is such a thing, upon UUs who draw comfort and wisdom and knowledge from other religions? Don't forget that many married couples come to the UU church because they are from different religious backgrounds. And they find us to be a non-judgmental place of welcome that goes beyond defining dogma or creed. And some of our children are here because their parents would rather they have a UU religious education than have it from one or other of their family faiths. And we have the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, who are seeking community, but not necessarily specific religious teachings. Rather, they emphasize values. So whatever has brought you to this place, I believe that we can work and worship together and transform the world in the mutual respect that is the grace of our covenant. But I didn't say it was easy. The Reverend Nancy McDonald Ladd gave a memorable sermon at the Sunday worship service at the 2016 General Assembly in Columbus, and you can find it on YouTube. I would recommend it highly. In it, she reminded us that relationship is the sandpaper that wears away our resistance to change. Born in deep relational encounters across differences, it smooths the way for the sacred, even as it rubs us raw. Congregations exist to be instruments of that abrasion. Those very encounters are our work. There is discomfort inherent in that work, and we often back away from the hard work of repeatedly relating meaningfully to one another and the world. One way we do this is to insist that you get what you want out of the experience of congregational life, as if church is a short order menu. One way to block the work is to imagine that congregational life of religious liberalism is like a contest where there are winners and losers. And if we don't get what we want, she famously says, then we are wanderers, worshipers, lovers of leaving. Ladd says that we need to lean in to do the work before us. Our capacity to engage and admit what we're here for in the first place, not the coffee, not the music, not the minister, is an aching need for an encounter that expands our hearts, to be a part of something larger than ourselves, to set aside our own need to win and seek a deeper understanding that comes with difference. The liberal church cannot enter into a coalition to move forward on terms we choose for ourselves, especially when we engage in interfaith work. The greatest impediment to building beloved community, Ladd says, is not real fights, but fake fights, inwardly focused fights. And in the meantime, all we care about is at stake in this moment of utmost urgency, while our own people and people of this world struggle to survive. Our movement needs to step more fully into encounters that count, that cross borders and divisions of our day. We don't have time for fake fights anymore that distract us from the world at hand. The real fight of systemic white power structure, for example, we need to be relevant and resistant. It's worth noting that John Dietrich, while being responsible for popularizing religious humanism in the 1920s and 1930s, so that it has now become a significant element in Unitarian Universalism, never rejected theism. He merely found no evidence for God himself. In his 1934 pamphlet entitled Humanism, I find the first word indicative of this perspective. If we live in a great impersonal universe with no friend to guide, it matters tremendously how we conduct ourselves, for we are actually the makers of human destiny. William Murray, author of Reason and Reverence, writes that when the merger between Unitarians and Universalists took place in 1961, humanism was replacing theism as the dominant ideological center of Unitarian Universalism. And he says that a rigid humanist orthodoxy resulted and became too entrenched, parochial, and illiberal. Murray describes himself as a humanistic religious naturalist. He says that this humanism speaks to him about becoming more fully human and involving the transformation of mind and heart from self-centeredness to a sense of oneself as part of a larger sacred whole and to a deep commitment to the human and natural worlds. It's about the transformation from a shallow life of fear, greed, hedonism, and materialism to a meaningful life of love and caring, gratitude and generosity, fairness and equity, joy and hope, and a profound respect for others. Humanistic religious naturalism promotes an ethical life in which one thinks and acts from a larger perspective than one's own egoistic interests, a life that affirms the worth and dignity of each person, a life filled with wonder and reverence for the extraordinary magnificence of this natural world and human creations. It includes gratitude for the gift of the heart and the capacity to enjoy it. This is the humanism, according to Murray, that's experiencing a revival in Unitarian Universalism, new because it integrates religious humanism with religious naturalism, resulting in a greater spiritual depth and a language of reverence, both of which many find missing in traditional religious humanism, but also renewing, because it also recalls the influence of transcendentalism within Unitarianism in the 1800s. This is a very appealing way of describing my own spiritual path, but so is the term panentheism, We're more familiar with the term pantheism, which means God is in everything, but panentheism is the other way around, that everything is in God. Deciding for myself what God is to me, whether it is love or whether it is the creative, creating stream of being and becoming that pervades the universe, does not preclude me from keeping covenant with someone who finds their path as an atheist or Buddhist to be the most authentic expression of their spiritual identity. John Burens and Forest Church write in Our Chosen Faith that in balancing and integrating mind and spirit, Unitarian Universalism has one goal above others: to make the religious more rational and the rational more religious. Reason, freedom, and tolerance. The challenge for us is to decide what we are doing here and how we use our freedom within our spiritual and religious practice. And I'm ready to join you in using these three pillars to build the beloved community, visualized in the metaphor of our closing hymn of tranquil streams that meet and merge and flow as one to seek the sea. Blessed be. Amen.